Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum and welcome. I am your host today. My name is Ubaid al-Mudallal. Thank you for taking the time to join us today as we talk about international solidarity with Gaza. Before I start, I want to send our deepest condolences to the families of the victims who were died in the last tragedy in a fire broke out in a residential building in Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza. As you know, Gaza has a full history of resistance, culture, and complexities. The besieged Gaza Strip and the fate of its resilient population are critical to the greater demand for Palestinian freedom and justice. For the last 15 years, the densely populated Israeli occupied Gaza Strip has been besieged by Israel by land, sea, and air. Around 2 million Palestinians, the vast majority of whom are refugees, are effectively trapped. After major military assaults by Israeli forces in the last 10 years, resulting in the deaths of thousands of Palestinians and very little reconstruction, Gaza is still suffering and in need for urgent needs. The siege of Gaza amounts to collective punishment, illegal under the Fourth Geneva Convention. As the occupying power, Israel has obligations to the people of Gaza under international law. On behalf of Gaza Relief, we are pleased to host a webinar entitled International Solidarity with Gaza, with our distinguished guest Miko Peled. To discuss the international solidarity movement with Gaza, what can we do in the West, and what is the impact of the annexation plans on Gaza, we invited Miko Peled to provide his truth-telling on the current situation. Miko Peled is one of the clearest voices calling for justice in Palestine, support of the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, and the creation of single democracy with equal rights in all of historic Palestine. Miko is also a contributor to several online publications and has been invited to speak all over the world. Wherever he is speaking, Miko dedicates the opportunity to advocate for the creation of one democratic state with equal rights for Israelis and Palestinians. He travels regularly to Palestine, where he speaks and works with the popular resistance, the BDS movement, and other justice groups. The webinar will be an illuminating talk that aims to cover the following topics in the context of Gaza. In the first section, we would like to hear about how Israel's annexation affects Gaza, also in the context of international solidarity, and what we can do here in the West to support BDS movement and the solidarity movement. In the second section, we would like to hear about the future of Gaza and what are the features of the future of Palestine in general and the solidarity movement. Thank you for joining us again. Miko, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to speak. It's a pleasure, although the things I have to say are not good or pleasant at all to hear. I think we know that the situation in Palestine is severe, in Gaza in particular, but really all over Palestine, particularly now. And I want to second your condolences to the people in Jabalia, the families of the people in Jabalia who were killed so tragically. And like you said, tragedy, of course, is nothing new to the people who live in Gaza and the Gaza Strip. Sadly, this concentration camp was created by Israel. This entire idea of a Gaza Strip, of course, it never existed before the early 1950s. It's a concept. It's part of the Zionist construct of Palestine, and it's where so many refugees now live. So many children live. I mentioned in my book, in the General Sun, I quote from the journalist Charlie Glass, who lived and worked in Gaza for many, many years, and he calls Gaza a world of children because so many children live in Gaza, and he describes the children every morning running to school and with their hair combed and their uniforms pressed by their mothers, running to school every day. And he said even in the children who are even able to be happy and playful even in a place like Gaza. So it's a terrible tragedy, and the world has just been allowing this reality to exist. What is Gaza? A 4-hour flight from Berlin, a 5-hour flight from London. I mean, it's very close to Europe. It's close to the West. It's really Palestine, of course, is one of the highest profile places in the world. And yet the world allows this horrific tragedy where now over 2 million people live in this concentration camp. And the only way we can ever see an end to it is if we all rise and demand that our elected officials stand up against Israel. The only way we can see an end to the tragedy of Palestine is if we demand that our elected officials stop their support for Israel, stop identifying with Zionism, which is a racist, brutal ideology. And we must demand severe sanctions against the state of Israel. It's the only way that we are ever going to see change. It's not going to come on its own. It's not going to come, from some heavenly decree. It's only going to come if we stand up and demand our elected officials and hold them accountable. Every country that supports Israel, every country that sends money to Israel, is the country that buys or sells weapons from Israel must stop immediately. That is a demand that has to take place. We all know that Israel just held elections, and Benjamin Netanyahu, the war criminal, is back. And, he's no worse a war criminal than any other Israeli prime minister, but he's been there the longest. And his impact on Palestine has been very strong. His impact is noticeable. The brutality and the cruelty in which Palestinians exist is to a large degree because of the policies that he's put in place. What is worse today, though, and I think we've seen the signs of it in Hebron earlier on Saturday, was that the settlers, the most right-wing, most fanatic, most violent, most racist gangs within Israeli society have been empowered now. They have a great deal of power within the Israeli parliament. They are going to have a seat in the Israeli cabinet holding very sensitive and very important portfolios. And their base, the very settlers, the very racist gangs that exist throughout all of Palestine, by the way, not only in the West Bank, but throughout all of Palestine, are empowered, and they are going to be out there terrorizing Palestinians even more than they've done before. And they have a history of terrorizing Palestinians everywhere. Some of you may recall in May of 2021 when there was an uprising in Palestine. All of Palestine rose as one to protest. The hundreds of them went into the cities of Lid, into the cities of Beer, into other places, Palestinian communities in the Naqab, in the south. They were up in the north, in the Galilee, of course, in Jerusalem. And they go by the hundreds, and they're armed, they're violent, they have no restraint whatsoever, they're above the law, they're never held accountable. And just yesterday or earlier today, depending on what time zone you're in, this Saturday, they invaded the old city of Hebron and terrorized Palestinians. And of course, the army is always supporting them, and the army is always with them. It's not supporting the Palestinians. And just to talk about Hebron for just another moment, if I may, Hebron is the largest city in the West Bank. The old city of Hebron, which is called H2, has some 20 or 25,000 Palestinians. It's a beautiful old city, ancient city, and within that city there are about 800 or 900 settlers who reside, of course, having taken over Palestinian homes and so forth, and they regularly terrorize Palestinians. This Saturday, some 30,000 settlers invaded the city, 30,000. And they ran across the city like gangsters, like violent, racist gangsters, destroying, terrorizing the Palestinians who live there. And we're going to see more and more of this, because now the new Israeli government, the one that will be formed any day now, is going to include their representatives in a big way. They make up now the third largest bloc in the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. And so, like I said, they will be in positions of power, and their base is empowered. And I think the result is going to be so severe for Palestinians that this year, 2022, which was a year in which a record number of Palestinians were killed, we're going to be looking at this year as the good old days, because what is coming up is so far worse than anything we've seen before. And so when it comes to Gaza, again, going back to Gaza, everybody knows what the attacks on Gaza, how horrific they were, and the reality in which Palestinians live in the Gaza Strip. I was in Palestine in August when Israel attacked Gaza once again, and I was talking to a friend in Gaza, and she was saying, she's a young mother, and she was saying, and I couldn't believe this, and I'm in Jerusalem and she's in Gaza, and we can't meet, of course, because Gaza is closed up. She was saying it was the worst she's ever experienced, and she's experienced all of the latest attacks on Gaza, 2008, 2012, on and on and on. And she said that one was worse. And I think with this new government, the attacks are going to be more punishing, more severe. The restrictions are going to be more severe, because that's what Israeli society demands, and particularly that segment of Israeli society, which, like I said, is now empowered. What's also interesting when we look at the results of the Israeli elections is 30% of soldiers, 30% of the military voted for these extreme gangsters, 30% of the army. And that is, that exceeds their own constituents, which is far smaller within Israeli society. And I think this is true within Israeli society too. A lot of what might be considered as mainstream Israelis voted for these right-wing gangs. So I think things are going to be severe, and they're already severe. But we're going to look back at the days that we see today as the good old days, because what is coming up is beyond imagination. And this is coming from someone who knows Palestine. I know Palestine. I know how severe the situation is. I know how severe it is for Palestinians. As for what we can do, I think it's obvious what we can do. The question is, are we going to do this? Like I said earlier, Gaza is not going to be saved by some, Salah ad-Din. Palestine, is not going to be saved by Salah ad-Din. Palestine is not going to be saved by some heavenly intervention. Gaza and all of Palestine, because you can't divide Gaza from the rest of Palestine. Palestine can only be liberated if one thing happens: if Israel collapses. The apartheid regime must collapse. There's no other way that Palestine can be liberated. And the only way it can collapse is with international intervention. Now, those of us that live in countries where we have elected officials have to demand that our elected officials act. In Germany, in the UK, in the United States, these are countries that contribute enormous amounts of money and enormous amounts of weapons to the apartheid regime of Israel. Now they do this, our elected officials support this, people that we vote for. And so And of course, we know very well that with very few exceptions, elected officials in the West across the board are Zionist and proud to say that they are Zionist. Saying that you're proud to be a Zionist is like saying you're proud to be a white supremacist. It's like saying you're proud to be an anti-Semite. It's basically saying you're proud to be a racist and support a brutal regime in Palestine. That's what it means. There is no positive way to spin what it means to be a Zionist. And if anybody ever had any doubt, then, well, of course, there's all you have to do is look at the history of Palestine over the last 100 years. Look what Zionism has done to Palestine and to Palestinians, and of course continues to do. So we have to demand, we have to write, we have to call our elected officials, and at the local level and at the national level. Members of parliaments, members of the Bundestag, members of Congress and Senate have to receive emails and phone calls and visitors to their offices by the hundreds, by the thousands, demanding sanctions against the state of Israel. Clearly demanding that no business, no trade, no cultural exchanges, demanding that Israel not be permitted to participate in the World Cup, which is about to start, not be permitted to participate in the Olympics, not permitted to participate in any sporting events, cultural events, diplomatic events, academic events. Israelis should be shunned. The state of Israel should be shunned. There have to be absolute sanctions against the state of Israel. There has to be absolute boycott against the state of Israel. Not only Israeli products, not only avocados and oranges, but I'm talking about an absolute policy of sanctions and boycott against this regime until it collapses. Because until that happens, Palestinians will continue to die. If we said, I don't know, a year or 2 years ago, that Shirin Abu Akleh would be assassinated, it would have sounded absurd. Well, she was assassinated, and nothing happened. No one was held accountable. No one is going to be held accountable. Here in the United States, the FBI announced they will start an investigation. They're not going to investigate they're not going to get very far. And we know very well, and if anybody doesn't know, I'll tell them very well, that the assassination of Shirin Abu Akleh the order to assassinate her had to have come from the highest levels of the chain of command, at least the Ministry of Defense, if not the Prime Minister's office. A shot like that could not have been taken without an okay or a direct order from a high level within the military and the defense apparatus. There's no way it could have happened. So, of course, you can't investigate this. They're not going to allow anyone to investigate this because they won't incriminate their own Minister of Defense and their own Prime Minister. They won't allow it. This can be said about, activists who are alive today. This is going to be said if we meet a month from now, 6 months from now, there will be so many more Palestinians who would have been killed. Personal friends of mine, close friends of mine, who I know, who I know intimately, who I know their children, I know their families, could be dead tomorrow, especially with the riots, with what is going on now in Hebron. It is frightening. It is frightening. And then what the process is usually the same. Someone gets killed. If it's someone is well known, then their picture is held up on is put up on social media. There might be protests in some of the cities around the world. And that's it. And then we sit and wait for the next one. We're always waiting. We're always reactive, as opposed to standing in the midst and securing and guaranteeing that no more Palestinians will be killed. Israel can decide, and may well decide, to attack Gaza tomorrow, next week, next month. We know that it will. We know that there is an attack impending at some point. We know that there's going to be another attack. We know that there will be people killed. People in Gaza know and expect this. And here we are sitting and talking. Where are we? Where are we demanding a guarantee for the safety and security of the people in Gaza? Where are we demanding the safety and security of Palestinians throughout. No Palestinian life is safe. No Palestinian life is secure. And no one is demanding a guarantee for the security and the safety of Palestinians. No one. It's not part of the conversation. I don't hear it anywhere. Palestinian lives are cheap. Palestinians are killed. Palestinians are tortured. Palestinians are arrested. Palestinians die from their injuries because they have no access to the medical care that Israel has, but Israel, of course, won't give them access. And, the list goes on and on and on. Palestinians cannot and will not be permitted to live a normal, healthy life as long as Israel exists, as long as the regime is in power. Only when we bring it down on their knees will Palestinians be able to breathe. And it's true for activists, it's true for journalists, it's true for children, it's true for elderly, it's true for every Palestinian who is alive today. There is a chance they will not be alive tomorrow. Again, whether it's in Hebron, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's in the Naqab, where Israel terrorizes the Palestinians in the Naqab. And many of the Palestinians, by the way, in Gaza have close ties to the Naqab because they're from the Naqab. Palestinians in Naqab and Palestinians in Gaza have very strong ties. And it's interesting because the Israeli settlements in the Naqab enjoy some of what can be considered the highest standard of living among Israeli citizens. The Palestinian Bedouin in the Naqab have the lowest standard of living, the poorest of the poor among Israeli citizens, because of course they are citizens of the state of Israel, albeit citizens of the third degree. But they are citizens, and they are the poorest of the poor living across the street from Israeli settlements who enjoy the highest standard of living among Israelis. And they are terrorized constantly. Their homes are being demolished by the thousands each year, and so on. Palestinians in Lid, Israeli airport sits on the occupied city of Lid. People in Lid also have very strong many strong relations with Palestinians in Gaza, refugees in Gaza, and so on. Because there's another close relationship between the city of Lid, always has been, and people in the Naqab and the people in Gaza. They live in horrendous conditions. They are killed and nobody talks about it. They're killed by settlers. They are killed in all kinds of different ways, all sorts of violence, and it won't stop. From time to time, the person killed gets some publicity, like I said, in social media, but then that's it, we forget. And what are we doing? And I said this several times, I'll say it again. What are we doing to stop it? What are we doing to secure the lives of Palestinians? And the answer is nothing. What are we doing to make sure that not another bullet, not a single bullet is sent to Israel? Not a single dollar, not a single pound, not a single euro is sent to Israel. What are we doing? We're not doing enough. We're doing very little. The other side is campaigning and is light years ahead of us. They're in the offices of the elected representatives. They're in the offices of all the different governmental and non-governmental organizations, making sure that nobody can criticize Israel. They have a very successful of weaponizing anti-Semitism, as we know. And no one but knows this better than the people in the UK because they saw Jeremy Corbyn be taken down by this. And yet, here we are, So I think we need to act. I think we need to become much more zealot. We need to be much more active. We need to drop the different arguments between us on our side of the issue. And we need to be absolutely dedicated to one thing, and that's the liberation of Palestine and securing the safety and security of Palestinians.
Thank you very much for this insightful talk. Allow me, please, to ask you some questions about the current situation and the future.
Sure.
What is the role of the boycott movement in isolating Israel internationally and exposing the crimes committed against civilians in Gaza?
Well, clearly, very little. I mean, there are some successes. There are a success here, success there, but by and large, very little. I mean, look, the reality is that Israel is strong. Israel is developing relations with other Arab countries. Israel is not only is Israel not interested at all in the idea of a Palestinian and respecting Palestinian rights, but look at the, like I said, the results of the Israeli elections. Clearly, the Israeli society feels very comfortable in the racism and the violence that it is to which Palestinians are exposed. And when you hear the rhetoric, when you hear the discourse on the Israeli news, in the Israeli streets, among the Israeli politicians, the hate-filled anti-Palestinian, anti-Arab rhetoric is beyond belief. When you hear them speaking, it's beyond belief. It's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. So there has been no movement, not only the BDS movement, but there has been no movement at all that is helping the Palestinian cause. None whatsoever. The situation is severe. The lives of Palestinians have never been in danger, and the safety of Palestinians has never been in danger as it is today. And like I said, we're going to look back at this year, which has seen record numbers of Palestinians killed, as the good old days, as this new government comes into power. So we're not seeing anything even close to an impact on the state of Israel. There's some rhetoric, there's some talk, among young people in Europe, some talk about young people in the United States, but it's nowhere near where it can make a difference, where it can make any kind of change.
What are the obstacles to that prevent the implementation of international law in lifting the siege on Gaza? And are there any solutions considering the Israeli government ignoring international law in the context of the siege on Gaza?
Well, the siege on Gaza is no different than the rest of Palestine. And the siege on Gaza will never end as long as the state of Israel stays as it is. The apartheid regime exists. Just like the rest of Palestine, just like the racism and the violence that we see in the West Bank, that we see in Naqab, that we see in Jerusalem. This is it. This is not going to change. The only way anything is going to change is when it all changes. Thousands of Palestinians in Israeli jails, including children being tortured. The siege, the horrific brutality of the siege on Gaza. The horrific reality within the West Bank, in the Galilee, again, every part of Palestine, there's not a single part of Palestine that is free from violence by the state of Israel and by Zionist gangs. And international law has no teeth. International law has there's no implementation. They can pass every law, they can condemn as much as they want, unless they put something in place, some action in place that can actually make a difference. Israel doesn't care about this. Israel doesn't care about international law because international law has there's no way to implement it. There's no way to enforce it. Certainly there's no way that we've seen anybody try to enforce it when it comes to Israel. And when it comes to securing the lives of Palestinians, it's become a joke. And until such time that we see serious sanctions being imposed and we see a real boycott against Israel, and the representatives of the state of Israel, until we see a time where Israel representatives, diplomatic or academic or otherwise, other representatives of the state of Israel be shunned completely, just like was done, by the way, in South Africa, just like what was done with apartheid South Africa. During the boycott on apartheid South Africa, if you invited a delegation from South Africa to an event in Europe, you would be penalized for even inviting them. Not only were they not invited, but part of it was actually sanctioning people in the West who did invite. You couldn't find their products anywhere. You couldn't find anything. And that's why it collapsed. And without us joining what I consider to be serious resistance and supporting the Palestinian resistance, Palestinians are doing all they can in Palestine under conditions that are impossible. Unless we support them 100% in all of their efforts and then do everything we can here on the outside to impose sanctions, to demand our elected officials do something, and something very specific, like I said, sanctions and boycott and so forth, there will be no change. There's no prospect whatsoever in the future for lifting the siege on Gaza unless the entire state of Israel collapses and is transformed into a real democracy with equal rights. That is the only way forward. That is the only way we're going to see relief for Palestinians. It's the only way we're going to see Palestine liberated. When Palestine liberated, it will all be liberated. Until all of Palestine is liberated, none of it will be liberated. There is no chance of any one segment or one part of Palestine seeing an end to this without all of it being, all of it ending.
What is the future of Gaza in your opinion, and what are the features of the future of Palestine in general and the solidarity movement?
I think this is a really good question. I think we need to look beyond solidarity. I think we need to look beyond occupation. When we look at the history of Gaza and we look at the history of all of Palestine, we need to look beyond 1948. Usually when people talk about the history of Palestine, they go, oh, 1948. No, no, no. Gaza has a history of thousands of years. Palestine has a history of thousands of years, glorious history. Gaza was a center of learning, center of culture, a center of trade. You know, it was a famous city, glorious city with enormous contributions going back thousands of years, as were other parts of Palestine. I don't know if you saw, if the listeners are familiar with Nur Masalha's book, Palestine, a 4,000-year history, where he relates the glorious history of Palestine going back 4,000 years, and he demonstrates clearly, academically, with proof, that the name Palestine, you know, granted, sometimes expressed in slightly different accents, but the name Palestine was used to describe Palestine going back 4,000 years, and the enormous contributions, even as late as 18th, 19th century. Palestine was an economic powerhouse. The Naqab would sell barley to the Brits. In other parts of Palestine, they were selling cotton and olive oil and so forth. First, Gaza was famous for oranges and fish and all kinds of things. You know, I mean, Palestine was a country that was in full bloom when it was stolen in 1948, and Gaza was no exception. Gaza was well, maybe it was an exception in the best possible sense of the word. It was rich, it was beautiful, it was promising. Like I said, trade and commerce and culture and learning and so on and so forth. Gaza was famous for that, as was Palestine. And there's this new interpretation, a Zionist interpretation of the history of Palestine, which says that the Jews came and made the desert bloom, that the Zionists came and made the desert bloom. This is a lie. This is a lie. They stole everything. They took a country that was in full bloom and stole it. And, you know, everything from money that was in the bank, because people had money in the banks, produce in the fields. And we know the produce, we know the Jaffa oranges, and we know, you know, and so on. Olive oil and cotton and so on, like I mentioned, and industry and buildings and hospitals and schools. I mean, they stole an entire country that was in full bloom, and then they pretended that they made it bloom, which is, of course, a terrible, terrible lie. And Gaza is part of that. Was part of that. You know, I know people in Gaza, older people in Gaza, who describe the fragrance of the orange blossom and the ocean, and you know. So I mean, this is what we need to look at, and I think if we understand the rich history of Palestine, we can envision the kind of rich future Palestine can and should have. I believe that once the Zionist regime falls, we will look back at this period as a very sad and dark and hopefully short period within this long and important history of Palestine. And then hopefully once we have a thriving democracy in Palestine, in a liberated Palestine, then we will be able to, Palestinians will be able to regain this richness. And I don't think it should be a problem, because as people should know, you know, Palestinians are, you know, one of the highest literacy rates in the world, one of the highest, I think in Gaza particularly, the highest rates of PhD per capita in the world, or one of the highest. I mean, we're talking about a society that is just waiting waiting to be liberated and be productive and create a thriving country once again, allowing Palestine to thrive once again. I believe as a democracy, from the river to the sea, from the northern bound borders with Syria and Lebanon, all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba, Palestine can and will be liberated and will thrive as a liberated democracy. But it's not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen as a result of a miracle. It's not going to happen because some Salah ad-Din showed up. It's only going to happen if we get off our backsides and demand in the strongest possible terms, ending the Zionist regime, the Zionist occupation of all of Palestine, and the establishment of a democratic, liberated Palestine, and demand it with no conditions and no uncertain terms. An unconditional surrender of the Zionist regime is the only thing that should be talked about. And then, we can. I believe the future can be bright if we do this.
Miko, how do you see the hypocrisy of the Western media when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war and the occupation of Palestine?
Well, I think it speaks for itself. I think the hypocrisy is obvious. I think it's clear that there's a big difference in the way these two countries are being treated. And here I live in Washington, D.C., and I've been to Europe. I was in Europe very recently, so I know this is taking place in Europe too. There you see Ukrainian flags flying everywhere. And my question is, or what what I'm thinking is, fine, you want to have Ukrainian flags, there's no problem. But where are the Palestinian flags? Europe is complicit in some of the worst crimes that are considered crimes against humanity when it comes to Palestine. Every home should have a Palestinian flag. Every home, every building, every government office should be flying a Palestinian flag. Fine, you want to put Ukrainian flags, put them up, put any flag you want, but we must be committed to the liberation of Palestine, and that should be expressed like that. Free Palestine signs and Palestinian flags should be everywhere. And sadly, that is not the case. And of course, that tells you exactly the hypocrisy and the double standard that Palestinians, by the way, have been suffering and seeing for a very long time, even before the war in Ukraine.
Do you accept in the presence of the new Israeli government, the right wing, that things will get worse?
Things will get worse. Absolutely,
Yes.
Things will get worse. That's what I said in my statement earlier. Things undoubtedly will get worse. There is no question that things are going to get worse. And what we saw in Hebron this Saturday is a sign of that. What we saw in Hebron this Saturday is the first step of what we're going to see. The terrorizing of Palestinians is going to get worse without any question. We're going to look back at this year. I think I said it twice already. This year has seen record numbers of Palestinians being killed. We're going to look back at this year as a good year in comparison to what's coming up with this new government, with the new coalition partner that Netanyahu has. We must act, and we must act. The severity, the urgency must be taken very seriously, because the situation is severe and it's only going to get worse, and the lives and the security of Palestinians, the safety of Palestinians is not guaranteed by anyone. A Palestinian can be killed at any point, at any time, by anyone, and there will be no consequences. Nobody will pay the price. And that is a very, very serious situation, and it's going to get worse.
Before we wrap up, please feel free to, if you have any further points you want to add just before closing.
Well, I think the possibility, people always ask about hope, so I want to end with that. I think we create hope. Hope is not something that comes from outside. We create hope, and if we want to create hope, and if we believe in freedom, if we believe in justice, if we believe in human rights, then we must act, and we must act soon. We have to create hope for Palestine. It's not something that's sitting there and will one day materialize. We must create hope. And the way we create hope is fight, and fight and join the Palestinians in their struggle to liberate Palestine. And the way we do it from the outside is talk to our elected officials and make sure that our elected officials stop identifying with Zionism, that they denounce Israel completely, that they demand sanctions, severe sanctions against the state of Israel, and that we can start by demanding that FIFA is about to start, that there will be serious protests against the Israeli team during the World Cup. This is the way we do it. Then we will have hope. That is how we create hope, by joining the Palestinian struggle. Then I believe we can create hope.
Yes. So on behalf of Gaza Relief, we would like to thank you for joining us today and for giving this fruitful talk about Gaza, Miko.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, and thank you all for attending this webinar. You can watch this on our social media platforms. Feel free to reach out for any questions. Thank you again, and salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you.